Alrighty, here we go. Let's get on with learning. So, let's see. Let me adjust this here a little bit, make sure. Hopefully you guys can see that better. Okay. So I'm going to give 2 points for whoever can tell me who that guy is on the title card slide. Just, I guess, email it to me or whatever, and if you get it, then I'll give you those 2 points. All right? So let's talk about Pavlovian classical conditioning. All right. First up, in the process of classical conditioning, a formally neutral stimulus called the conditioned stimulus gains the ability to elicit a response called the conditioned response because it has been paired with some other stimulus called the unconditioned stimulus that reliably elicited that response, the unconditioned response, in the past. That's a little bit close here. There you go. All right. So this sounds very, very difficult. Let's start with an example. All right. And then when we get to an example, we'll kind of diagram that out and delineate and make sure that we can come up with the right fit for each of these 4 parts. So, classical conditioning, let me move this a little bit more, basically has 4 different parts. Each scenario of classical conditioning that you come across, you're going to have 4 separate little instances. You're going to have 2 stimuli, and you're going to have 2 responses. The first is the unconditioned stimulus. Now, anytime you see the word unconditioned, that means that there is no learning. That means there is no processing, there is no association, there is no work being done whatsoever. All right, so unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, those are prior to the learning, prior to the pairing, prior to the association. Now, again, this is going to make a lot more sense here in just a second, but anytime you see the word conditioned, conditioning is the same as the learning, is the same as the pairing, is the same as the association between one stimuli and another. So you have a conditioned stimulus and you have a conditioned response. So you can think of these kind of like a cause and effect. So the 2 stimuli, the unconditioned and the conditioned stimulus, are the 2 causes. These 2 stimuli produce a particular response. The response will be the result. So you have a cause and you have a result. You have a cause and you have an effect. You have a stimulus and you have a response. All right, so here's an example. Kind of going back to this, according to Hoyle definition. When I was 3, we lived in a house that had orange carpet in my room. This is an example I give in most all of my classes. In that room, I received my very first spanking. All right? I cried like a little girl. Then, because the orange carpet was associated with the spanking, every time I walk into a room with orange carpet, I start crying. Boom. That is an instance of classical conditioning. So, for these 2 things, these 4 parts of each of this definition, let's break down this example, okay? So we have, when you do these, 99% of the time, for all intents and purposes, the 2 responses, the conditioned and the unconditioned response, are going to be the same. So those are usually the easiest to figure out. So you've got, in my example, you've got the spanking, you've got the orange carpet in the spanking scenario, then you've got the crying, and you've got the orange carpet every time I cry. That's not a very good example. I'm not explaining this for you. I got a spanking in a room with an orange carpet. Every time I go into... I got a spanking in a room with orange carpet and I cried. Now, every time I go into a room with orange carpet, I start crying. I have essentially associated the orange carpet with the sad, scary scenario of getting the spanking. So now the orange carpet is able to elicit the response all by itself without the presence of the spanking. Okay? Let's see. That was not a really good example. And it's hard to kind of differentiate classical conditioning from instrumental conditioning. We're going to get into instrumental conditioning here in just a little bit. But again, kind of keep this orange carpet spanking example in your mind here. We're going to break this down, and it's going to make a lot more sense. Talking like this, telling it to you, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So let's kind of break down this original definition and assign each of the 4 parts for the orange carpet spanking example. All right, so again, when you're breaking these things down, the 2 responses are, for all intents and purposes, going to be the exact same. So, got a spanking, and I cried. The room had an orange carpet, and now every time I go into a room with orange carpet, I start crying. So you've got 2 instances of crying. So crying is going to be your response. One of them is unconditioned, and the other is conditioned. One of them requires learning and association or pairing, and the other does not. Another way to think about this is the unconditioned stimulus is that which normally produces the response. That might kind of help you break this down when you're kind of diagramming and cataloging these things. The unconditioned stimulus, that thing that requires no learning, no association, no pairing, nothing, that is the thing that normally would produce the response. Okay, so in our example, it's usually easiest to start with the 2 responses because, again, they're going to be the same. So crying in each of these scenarios is present in the spanking scenario and in the orange carpet scenario. So crying is our 2 responses, our unconditioned and our conditioned. You could just write those down and label them right now. The part that usually gives students the trouble is the stimulus. What causes the crying? Something, again, you're going to have a cause and you're going to have an effect. Something is going to produce some kind of response. So the unconditioned stimulus is that thing that does not normally produce the response. Unconditioned stimulus is that thing that does normally produce the response, and it does not require any kind of association or pairing or learning with any other stimulus in order to have its effect. So in this situation, since our response is crying, what would normally produce the crying? The spanking. So the spanking is that thing that normally produces one of our responses. So the spanking does not require any learning, any association, or any pairing, and therefore that is the unconditioned stimulus. The conditioned stimulus is kind of the kicker. The conditioned stimulus is that thing which requires pairing with the unconditioned stimulus in order to gain its power, in order to be able to produce the response on its own. In this case, the conditioned stimulus is the orange carpet. Orange carpet does not normally make children cry, but being paired or being associated with the unconditioned stimulus, i.e. the spanking, it now gains, it kind of draws its power from that, and now it's able to elicit that response on its own. And the more repeated pairings you have between the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus, the more likely, the stronger the conditioned stimulus becomes, and the more reliably it's going to be able to produce that conditioned response. So if I got several spankings within that room with the orange carpet, then that pairing, that association, that learning, I would learn that orange carpeted rooms are not a good place to be because spankings generally happen within them. And so every time I walked into an orange carpeted room, I would start to, cry or get scared because I would be anticipating a spanking because it had been paired or associated with that unconditioned stimulus, the spanking, in the past. Again, this I don't like the way that the book kind of words this and puts this out because it is so convoluted and it is so difficult to kind of convey that information. But if you keep in mind that again, your two responses are the same, and when you're given an example of this, make sure that you can break it down and make sure that you can recognize the individual causes and the individual effects. So if you're given a paragraph or something like that describing some kind of situation, make sure that you pull out the two things that are the same, because those two things more than likely are going to be your responses. Now look at what is it that normally produces that response, and then go back to your example and read through that and say what normally produces the crying or the salivation or whatever. That will be your unconditioned stimulus. That will be that thing that normally produces the response. It requires no learning, no pairing, no association, no nothing. That is just a normal cause to effect. Now you've got 3 out of 4. Now you've got to go back and look at what also in your example might cause the effect that you're looking at. And it usually is something that has absolutely nothing to do with the response. Orange carpet has absolutely nothing to do with crying. But when it's paired with the unconditioned stimulus, that thing that normally produces the response, i.e. the spanking, then it gets its power. That is where it kind of draws the force, if you will. And that is how it is able to elicit its own response without the presence of the unconditioned stimulus, that thing that normally would produce that response. Okay, so if we go back into our little red text definition here, in the process of classical conditioning, a formerly neutral stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, in which case this would be the orange carpet, gains the ability to elicit a response, the crying, because it has been paired with some other stimulus, the spanking, that reliably elicited that response, crying, in the past. So hopefully that example kind of, when we break this down, that example kind of helps you illustrate that each of these 4 parts are going to be present in every single situation of classical conditioning you come across. If you go on to take a developmental class, you'll see this stuff again. This is really, really big, really, really fundamental, really, really important stuff psychologically. Pavlov was pretty groundbreaking when he discovered this phenomenon with his dogs. And you can go on, hundreds of different websites and read about Pavlov and his dogs. And I think there's even an episode of The Office where Jim was pranking Dwight with a mint every time his computer dinged or whatever. Classical conditioning is a pretty well-known, pretty fundamental tenet of psychology. So it's really important that you understand, kind of how to break this down and exactly what was going on and what each instance of classical conditioning means. So again, if you have any questions about that, or something's not clear, shoot me an email and I'll go over it with you again, because it is when it's worded like this, it is pretty convoluted and a little bit confusing. But again, if you break it down into each of those 4 parts and you start to look at each individual component within that, and you start to frame it from the concept of something is causing something else, this cause and effect relationship, then it's really not as confusing as a lot of students make it out to be. All right. Although the conditioned response reliably follows the conditioned stimulus, after repeated pairings of the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, after a while something called extinction occurs, whereby the conditioned stimulus fails to reliably produce a conditioned response. Basically, the conditioned stimulus will lose its effect over time unless it is, again, reliably paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So if I stopped getting spankings in that orange carpeted room for a while, eventually I would kind of start to calm down, and it would almost kind of have this opposite effect whereby, orange rooms might even have some kind of a calming effect, because now, previously they were very, very stressful, but I no longer get the spankings in there. So now I'm either really confused or I'm really, really grateful that they are no longer there. This is called extinction. So if you want to maintain that pairing, if you want to maintain that association and maintain the conditioned stimulus's ability to elicit that response, then every once in a while you need to get a spanking in an orange carpeted room. This can be translated, and it can be applied to just almost an infinite array of behaviors and behavior modifications and all kinds of things like advertising and things like that. Use classical conditioning all the time. Animal, training your dog to do one thing or not another, giving him or her a treat every time they come in will kind of reinforce that, and they will start to pair the good feeling of the treat with whatever it is that they did, and that will again strengthen the behavior. And that's how you train dogs. That's how you train tigers and whatever. So extinction can also be a thing as well, where the conditioned stimulus kind of loses its ability to elicit or affect that conditioned response. So it's got to be, again, repaired every once in a while in order to kind of maintain that bond, maintain that association. This is important from a motivational viewpoint in that previously neutral stimuli in our environment can come to have motivational influences on our behavior if they are paired with unconditional stimuli that are strongly motivational. So this is basically just saying that things that are kind of nothing to us can come to have strongly motivational factors if they are paired with things that are strongly motivational. This is where things like a lot of phobias can come from this type of phenomenon right here. A lot of phobias are rooted in classical conditioning. And sometimes you might have one bad experience with a clown when you were 2 that you probably don't even remember, and that sunk itself deep within your psyche, and now every single time you see a clown, it effectively brings out that physiological panic attack and essentially reinforces itself, because you never take the time to meet with clowns who are not scary. So that counter conditioning never has the ability to take hold. Fears of flying, fears of snakes, fears of spiders, fears of heights, everything. Because a lot of people are so unwilling to face their fears and unwilling to kind of reverse or counter condition that effect. A lot of these phobias can stick with you for the rest of your life. So psychologically speaking, facing your fears is a good thing. But again, you always run the risk of, if you have a fear of flying, taking that one flight, and if something goes wrong, that's going to strengthen and reinforce and pretty much cement and solidify that fear in you forever. And no amount of sweet talking yourself or, pumping yourself up will ever be able to get that. But 99% of the time, you're going to be okay. So again, a lot of phobias and a lot of irrational types of behaviors, smoking, overeating, gambling, sex addiction, whatever. A lot of addictive types of behaviors can also be rooted in classical conditioning. Something, in your past or something down your line that you have repressed and you don't remember got paired or associated with something either very pleasurable or something very, very non-pleasurable, something very, very painful or scary. And that took root and wormed its way through your psyche, and now you have some kind of irrational fear of cotton balls or clicky pins, and you have no idea why. It's probably something from your past that you've repressed and you just haven't faced it yet. But these things can be overcome, and a good therapist will have you. We're going to talk about systematic desensitization here in just a little bit. That is kind of the process of overcoming these deep-seated, previously conditioned responses that have been essentially reinforced your entire life because you've never taken the time to face your fears and pair them with a positive stimuli. So you keep kind of working yourself up and reinforcing the negative aspects of these, and in the meantime you are effectively inherently strengthening the fear, strengthening the association between that and whatever it is you're afraid of. For all practical purposes, this learning is passive. If conditions are right, the learning will occur whether we want it to or not. This suggests that some maladaptive behaviors, such as phobias, may be learned through accidental pairings of neutral stimuli and negative emotional or motivational states. This is just exactly what I was just talking about. Just as motivated behaviors can result from classical conditioning, so may reactions be eliminated in a similar manner. This is called counterconditioning, and involves a pairing of a negatively conditioned stimulus with a strongly positive unconditioned stimulus. So this is again kind of the therapeutic effect of how do you get over these deep-seated phobias. And phobias are kind of a really good example of how to illustrate this effect, but it goes for almost anything. So let's say you have a fear of flying, and you've just taken a job that requires a whole lot of travel. Well, now you've got a problem. If you have an inherent fear of flying, you better get over that if you want this really good, really high-paying job that requires a lot of travel. So you go see a therapist and you say, hey, doc, I've got a problem with flying. I'm terrified of it, but I need to get over it, and I need to get over it quick. So what the doctor will do is he will start to get you to imagine, instead of crashing and burning and dying in a fiery death, start to think of yourself, start to pair the act of flying with something positive. Like, going to your happy place, or meditating, or listening to music, or whatever it might be. So you're starting to kind of rewrite and overlay the act of flying with something positive instead of something negative, and that's called counterconditioning. The negative conditioned stimulus gradually loses its aversiveness by being paired with the positive unconditioned stimulus instead of a negative unconditioned stimulus. So that's going to your happy place instead of imagining dying in a fiery crash. Counterconditioning is preferred over extinction because not only does it involve a disintegration of the conditioned stimulus conditioned response pairing, but it provides a positive response to replace the previously negatively conditioned one. So it's better to replace that negative aversive state that's been associated with flying or with whatever, but it's better to replace it with a positive stimulus than it is to just let the system kind of work itself out on its own and let the association extinguish itself naturally. Because invariably you're going to flip on the news or something and read about some plane crash somewhere, and you're going to go, ha yeah, I knew it, these things are not safe at all, and you're going to effectively kind of subconsciously reinforce that to yourself. So if you can go in and do the counter conditioning and do it in a way that replaces the dying in a fiery crash with